I'm Michael Dow. You are listening to US Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Joining George Smart in New York from the Architecture+Design Film Festival are Alton Guilfoyle, producer of the film Frank Gehry, Building Justice; Paul Clemence, director of the documentary Two Pianos; and the Samuel L. Jackson of design documentaries, Alan Hess, appearing in a new Jake and Tracy Gorst film, Frey, Part 1, The Architectural Envoy. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from modernist realtor Angela Roll.
Welcome to Episode 6, Return of the Modernist. In our continuing imaginary space saga, Princess Angela Roll returns to her home planet of Vandero to rescue the iconic Saroyan villa from the vile gangster Max McMansion. Despite admiring the villa's architect, Tad Vader, Darth's second cousin on the dark side, Princess Angela is determined to save the historic villa with the galactic historic tax credits and her new ion-powered circular saw. Angela has no idea she's walking into a trap.
It's a trap!
As the Empire begins construction on planet Vandero of a massive new development, Deathville Acres. When complete, homes of at least 250,000 square feet, garages not included, will spell doom for her brave modernist rebels struggling to restore great architecture. Centuries earlier in 2019, however, you can count on Princess Angela's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter.
That's a lot of greatness.
A real estate agent with specialized design training, advising buyers and sellers of modernist houses on everything from appropriate renovation to knowing that a parsec is a unit of distance, not time. If you get that reference, you're a true Star Wars fan. Angela Roll is your special real estate agent. Reach her at angelaroll.com, that's ROEHL, or 919-995-0550. Hi, folks. I'm George Smart. This is the second year U.S. Modernist Radio has visited the Architecture+Design Film Festival in New York. A really great time. I encourage you to go next year, and I hope to see you there. Executive Director Kyle Bergman puts together wonderfully brilliant, thought-provoking documentaries, not only for New York, but to other locations across the country. If you have a chance to go to one of these, do it. And at this particular theater in Chelsea, I had a powerful emotional experience because they have Doritos popcorn.
Really?
It's not rocket science. It's just movie theater popcorn covered in that wonderful orange Doritos dust.
That sounds like rocket science to me.
It's incredibly expensive, and I must admit somewhat disgusting. However, I could not stop eating it. And your fingers will be bright orange, so get plenty of napkins.
Alton Guilfoyle's award-winning films have been shown on PBS and HBO in the U.S. and the BBC, ITV, and Channel 4 in the UK. He is author of 2 books about design and architecture called Spoon and 1000 Design Classics. Guilfoyle produced sketches of Frank Gehry, Making Space, 5 Women Changing the Face of Architecture, and his latest, Frank Gehry, Building Justice, where architect Frank Gehry, philanthropist George Soros, and students at SciArc and Yale redesign prison architecture for the complex social, political, racial, and aesthetic issues behind incarceration. George and Alton kick off the conversation talking about his first Frank Gehry film, about Bilbao, a museum which transformed museum design and city planning.
How did your attention turn to architecture with the first film on Frank Gehry?
Well, actually, back up a little bit. My first film on architecture was about Frank Lloyd Wright. It was 1071 Fifth Avenue, a film about the Guggenheim, which I did as part of the production company that I ran in London with Bob Geldof. And I did it with Richard Rogers, now Lord Rogers, the architect. We had a great time doing that film. And when I got back to London and was moping around London, I guess, I got a call from the Guggenheim asking me had I ever heard of a place called Bilbao. So I said I had, of course. Anybody in Europe knows where Bilbao is. They've got a very famous soccer team. So they said, we need you to get a crew and film something top secret next week in Bilbao. So I said, okay. So I made a few calls and got a crew from Barcelona, and I met them in Bilbao. And the top secret event was the signing of the agreement to build the Guggenheim Bilbao. That was the first time I met Frank Gehry.
Oh, okay.
And that was about 1993, I think. A long time ago.
25 years ago.
Yeah, 21. Maybe 92, actually. 91 or 92. Because the Guggenheim Bilbao opened October 1997. So I guess, yes, it was 91 or 2. And so I went to Bilbao, met Frank. Then events took their turn, as these things do. And the Guggenheim asked me to come and set up a film department. This was a very new idea for a museum, to have a film department, both in terms of curated film, in other words, art on film or art on video. Video art was very, very early in its process at that point. It's now exploding, of course, but in those days, there was very little video art. So they asked me to set up a film department, but also to make films about the activities at the Guggenheim, because at this stage, I had done a film about Frank Lloyd Wright. I did a film about Dan Flavin, the minimalist artist. I did a film with Klaus Oldenburg, all for British television. And so I think the director of the Guggenheim thought, this guy's coming over here and filching all our best material. We should just get him here and make films. And so I did. I came and set up the film department. And that was the beginning of my friendship with Frank. At that point, by the time I came over, Bilbao was coming out of the ground. The foundations had been laid and so on. So one of my jobs for the next several years was to spend a lot of time in Bilbao filming the building being built. And I did. I think I filmed it more than any individual in the world, really. And also in that time getting to know Frank and his team. Edwin Chan was leading the studio in Frank's office. Of course, it was Frank's building, but Edwin, all architects have
studio leaders
and teams underneath them, and Edwin and Michelle Kaufman were part of that, and so I got to know those guys really well, and we had tremendous fun going back and forward to Bilbao over the course of several years. And then, of course, the opening, which was a great event. Nobody really knew how this was going to play out. I mean, we could see this amazing building emerging from the ground, but, one was not at all certain about what the public reaction might be. Of course, we know now, historically, the public reaction was huge.
Right, it's called the Bilbao effect.
Well, indeed, and I think that's a little misguided as well, because, if you look at some of the great urban projects of the last 60, 70, 80 years, each of them has had an effect. I mean, Frank himself talks about the Chartres effect of, Chartres Cathedral was built on a plain in northern France, and you can see it from a long way away, and that was deliberate. The builders of Chartres wanted the populace to be able to see this amazing edifice from a long way away, so that it would have an effect. It would draw them to it. But Frank himself talks about that Chartres effect. And then if you look into the modern terms, Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers created Beaubourg, which was this pivotal building in the rejuvenation of that part of Les Halles in Paris, which is the Pompidou Center.
Oh, sure.
And the Pompidou Center has, to this day, got a Pompidou effect. On a summer day, any summer day in Paris, if you go to Beaubourg, that little area near Les Halles, and you go to the Pompidou Center, there's a piazza out front. And that piazza has 5,000 or 6,000 people in it on any given lunchtime in Paris. That's the Pompidou effect, or the Beaubourg effect, I would say. And so that was 30 years before Bilbao. So it had a tremendous impact on that part of Paris. And one might say it had a tremendous impact on Paris and French life overall as a pivotal point for modernism. And Madame Pompidou, who ran that competition, took a huge risk in choosing Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers. That was their first building as a collaborative team. They knew each other, of course, very well. Were best friends, still are to this day best friends. But it was a huge risk, and it paid off in spades. Then, of course, fast forward to 1997, and the Guggenheim Bilbao opens, and it had an extraordinary effect on the world and on that part of Spain, the Basque Country. And it's important to know that the Basque government itself understood the value of the built environment at a high level. So they had already commissioned Norman Foster to do some subways, James Stirling to do a building, the noted British architect. So they understood the value of the built environment and the value of getting really great architects to do work in Bilbao. So they also had Santiago Calatrava build a footbridge and then an airport. So all over the Basque Country and all over Bilbao specifically, the Basque government was promoting and building great works by great architects. So the Guggenheim Bilbao wasn't out of place in that sense. It was part of a program, but it had a huge effect. Now, I remember at the time being in Bilbao, enjoying the festivities of the opening. I was working, of course, but I was also enjoying myself. It's impossible not to in Spain, and in the Basque Country particularly. And I remember at the time talking to Herbert Mouchamp, the New York Times architecture critic who sadly passed away. Herbert was a wonderful guy, brilliant writer, and but we were having a glass of wine in the Guggenheim at one of the gorgeous little bars that Frank designed in the building. And we were kind of marveling at the place and being there and having the privilege of being there over several days and evenings and dinner well into the night. And he said, the interesting thing is, I think this is going to have a profound effect, but I don't think we'll really see that effect played out for another 15 or 20 years. Of course, sadly, he didn't live to see the effect played out, but I think now, 20 years later, we can say that that building has had a profound effect on architecture around the world.
Your first film, Sketches of Frank Gehry, is, 10 years old now?
Well, that wasn't my first film. That was my first film with Frank Gehry.
Right, the first one with Frank Gehry.
Yes, 2006, 12 years old.
12 years old.
So that came out of the opening. So the story of that film is interesting because I was in Bilbao working for the Guggenheim, as you know, and Charlie Rose called me in New York and he said, "Are you going to Bilbao for the opening?" I said, "I am." And he said, "Look, I'd love to do something about Bilbao, about this opening, but I can't get PBS to pay for anything. Could I borrow your crew? Could you just direct a little sequence for me and just do it as a favor?" I said, "Yeah, of course." So I met Charlie in the atrium in Bilbao with Frank, and I had my crew there, and we were shooting this little piece that Charlie was doing, an interview with Frank. And Frank said, "Good God, that's Sidney Pollack knocking on the door." And we looked over, and there was Sidney. The place was closed, hadn't opened yet. It was 2 days before the official opening. And there was Sidney kind of peering in, and a guard was kind of getting annoyed with him and saying, "Excuse me, move on." And so Frank, we dropped out, Sidney, come in." Frank was a friend of Sidney's from Santa Monica. The story is Sidney's wife, Claire, and Frank were in group therapy together. And they all became pals.
Right.
They were all great friends. Blake Edwards was in there as well. It was a famous group run by Milton Wexler, the famous
therapist. Yeah.
So Frank knew Sidney, but Sidney wasn't interested in architecture. He wasn't particularly a modernist. He just knew Frank. But Sidney was in Madrid opening Sabrina, his remake of the classic film, and it was being panned. And he had in his bag an invitation to an opening of the Guggenheim Bilbao from Frank. And he put it in his bag because his assistant had given it to him, but he looked at it, he thought, how do you go to an opening of a building? I mean, just open the door. What do they do? I don't know. But he was having such a hard time in Madrid, and having such a miserable time in Madrid, being yelled at by critics and journalists and so on about how bad his film was, that he thought, what the hell, I might as well go to Bilbao. And he flew himself around the world in his own jet. So he got in his jet and he flew to Bilbao. And he walked down to see, and there was Frank and Charlie Rose and me and a couple of other people. So we all went out and had a very rambunctious lunch.
I bet.
And so that began 3 days of knocking around with Sidney Pollack and Frank and people around the opening of the Guggenheim of Bilbao. And so at one stage I was sitting with Frank and he said, "It'd be great if Sidney would make a film about all this, wouldn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, but you'll never get Sidney to do it. I'll do it for you, Frank, if you want." And he said, "No, I want you to do it, but can you ask, should I ask Sidney?" And I said, "Well, do you want me to ask Sidney?" And he said, "Yeah, okay." So I called Sidney and I asked him, and then Frank called Sidney and Frank asked him, And then about a month or two later, Sydney called me and said, I'm so embarrassed about this. I just have to do it. So you got to help me with this because, man, I don't know how to make a documentary. And even if I did, people would laugh at Sidney Pollack now at this stage of my career, just suddenly turning around to making a documentary about architecture about which I know zero. So I said, okay, let's do it. And we spent 6 years. We had a great time doing it.
It's a great buddy film. It really is.
It kind of is, and the funny thing is they weren't such great buddies at the start, but they became good buddies over the course of the 6 years. There was a difference in age, there was a difference in perception between them. Sydney knew very little about art, for example. Frank is a polymath on art. He really, really understands, and he has the intellectual ability, of course. He's a genius, but he has also just the instinct of an artist and the way an artist thinks and works. And he would be the first to say his architecture isn't art. It has plumbing, it has lights that have to switch on, and people have to go up and down stairs and so on. So that's what separates him from an artist. He's a great architect, and he'd be the first to make that distinction.
Most millennials, I think, know Frank Gehry from his appearance on The Simpsons. Did that happen about this time?
Yes, it did. It was very funny, actually, because Sydney and I were in a car in Santa Monica, and we were talking about it. And he said, why on earth The Simpsons? And I said, I guess Jim Brooks called Frank and said, Jim Brooks was the executive producer.
The famous Jim Brooks, yeah.
James L. Brooks, yeah. Famous film producer. And Sydney said, wait a minute, Jim Brooks produces The Simpsons? I said, yeah, he does. Damn it, that's how he's so rich. So anyway, so that was in the air at the time. We decided not to use that clip because it was too inside baseball, really, to use the American term. It was too self-referential for us to use. We loved it, of course.
Yeah.
And Frank in his office has one of the drawings from one of the cells from the animation, or since they don't use single cell animation anymore, it was a kind of just a
print
out of one of the scenes, and that's sitting up on his wall. It's a great moment, yeah.
So tell me about this film.
A couple of years ago, Frank called me. I was driving in New York in the winter, and he said, I met with George Soros and Chris Stone, who runs his foundation, and those guys want to deal with mass incarceration. They want to do something about mass incarceration. They're going to put some money into lobbying and policy making and doing the things they do to try and bring an end to this era of mass incarceration. 2.3 million people in jail in America, jails and prisons in America. And he said, they want me to design a prison. I'm not going to design a prison. Nobody would ever invite me to design a prison. But I want to do something for them because I think it's a really important issue. And they said, should we make a film about it? And they had some ideas about who they should get. And I said, well, if you want to make a film about it, I'll call Elton. He should do it. I said, thanks a lot, Frank. What are you getting me into here? And he said, well, I don't really know. I'm going to try and do it as a studio in Yale and maybe SciArc, and this will be my last studio. I'm not going to teach for much longer. I'm getting too old. At the stage, he was 88. He's a very vibrant 89-year-old now. So I said, well, I'm in, Frank. If you want me to do it, I'll do it. And I said, who's paying for it? That's the first thing a producer always asks.
Of course.
Right? And he said, well, I don't know, really. I guess we can get some money from Soros if this is his project. But I'll leave that to you.
Right.
That's like a hospital pass, that's like a Hail Mary pass.
Yeah.
Just throw the ball right down the field and see if Elton will catch it. So anyway, I did. I pulled the money together, the resources together, and set off in the film. It was it's a wonderful pivotal moment for Frank at this stage of his career. Frank doesn't have to do anything, as risky as this. He's devoting so much time, so much of the resources of his studio, of his partners, his people, his time, which is scarce, He doesn't have to do that, but he did. He did it because he really is a strong believer in social justice, in the political and social sense, and he really wanted to do this, and he wanted to make an impact. He always wants to make an impact, whether he's making the best museum or the best concert hall or whatever it might be. He never settles for second best. He believed strongly, and this has been borne out by fact, that if he could get a conversation going in the schools like Yale and SCI-Arc, Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles, that the effect of that conversation, of those studios, would ripple outwards and would start to be felt by policymakers and by other architects and other institutions. And that's exactly what's happened. So Deborah Burke, who's a brilliant architect here in New York, and who's the dean of
Deborah.
Yeah, dean of the Yale School of Architecture now. She took over from Robert Stern. She jumped at the idea when Frank presented to her. And now, in the second year of this program, she's running a year-long course in restorative justice as part of a criminal justice, social justice component of the architecture studies at Yale. And it's mandatory, which makes it even better.
Nice.
So Frank was right about that he could do something with the schools. And so I started shooting. We went various places. We went to Norway with a bunch of students, saw the Norwegian system up close. We're profoundly impressed by that.
Oh, yes.
And we're so far away from that in this country, you know, with our era of mass incarceration, which has a whole history that you know about from Ava DuVernay's film and Michelle Alexander's work and all of that. So we know the history of it. And slowly, people are beginning to recognize on both sides of the political divide that whatever the political aspects of mass incarceration, which involve locking up 2.3 mainly black and Latino men, the sheer cost of it in this country is crippling.
Staggering.
Crippling to the States.
Staggering.
So it's starting to turn around now. And so we went and we made the film. That's the film we're showing this weekend at this festival.
Do you know about the video game?
I do, yeah.
Prison Architect?
Yeah.
So the game, I played a little bit. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting how when I tried to build a developmental prison, a Norwegian model kinds of prison, that the mayors of the city and other officials would want to cut my funding and make me make awful decisions about what I would do. And then I tried to make the very harsh prison, and of course I had riots. Yeah. And it was an interesting experience of having to actually make the decisions behind all of that.
Well,
something.
That's right. I know the game, but I don't play it, and I'm not familiar with it. But the reality is also that when the client is the city or the state, the decisions around prison design are largely budgetary. How do we build a big warehouse, make it as uncomfortable and as punishing as we can, and with the minimum attention to human comfort, let alone any of the nobler goals of rehabilitation and redemption and so on. They're just never even part of the conversation in this country. The problem is that apart from just doing tremendous damage to people who deserve much better treatment, many of whom, if not most of whom, are in there for non-violent crimes and often for trumped-up crimes.
Right.
Not only are those people impacted, but the people who work in them are impacted. I mean, if it's hot in a prison, and they deliberately make it hot to make people uncomfortable in the summer, and they deliberately make it cold in the winter to make people uncomfortable. But if it's hot in a prison, it's hot for everybody. If it's cold in a prison, it's cold for everybody. So one of the things that I discovered in the making of the film is that corrections officers and prison guards, they suffer tremendously in these places. They have to go to work in these places. The levels of stress are enormously high, and the stress comes from the job itself because it's not an easy job. But a lot of that stress comes from the design of the prisons. And I asked James Forman, the professor of law in Yale, wonderful guy, wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Locking Up Our Own. I asked him about that. I said, why don't the unions demand better for their members? He said the unions have made, over the course of 50 years, have made profound mistakes because they've asked for the wrong things. True, they've got very good wages and benefits for their members, but they have some of the worst working conditions in the world. It causes huge amounts of domestic abuse, higher levels of PTSD than returning veterans, higher levels of domestic abuse than veterans, highest levels of alcoholism and other drug addiction among that sector of the working population. So it's a bad scene all around, and those guys have a terrible job to do.
And a number of those prisons are private and not unionized.
Yes, I mean, that's a trend that is complicated and some would say controversial trend, but in the overall complexion of prisons in America, prisons and jails in America, the private side is still relatively small.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking with me. It's really been a pleasure, and I hope to get to see the film soon. I didn't get a chance to see it this week while I was here, but will people be able to buy it or stream it at some point?
Yes, we finished this film last Friday. Carl Bergman, my dear friend who runs this festival, and Ivana La Rosa, who's the general manager, they were very patient with me. I said I'd get them the film. They didn't think they'd have to wait until the 11th hour before I even got them the file, but I only finished it Friday. So we'll work on all the distribution things next.
Well, wonderful. It's a real pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you.
George, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Coming up, more from the New York Architecture and Design Film Festival featuring Paul Clemence and Alan Hess.
Writer Mike Welton,
Thank you, Mike.
of Architects and Artisans, told us about Paul Clemence, producer of the film Two Pianos. And within a few days, Paul and I were talking in New York. Paul's book on Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House remains the most complete photo documentation of that iconic design, and his many photographs have appeared in Metropolis, Arch Daily, Architizer, Casa Vogue Brazil, and his own blog, Archiphoto, which has over 800,000 followers worldwide. Two Pianos is about the Italian architect Renzo Piano, the film capturing his masterful use of light, carefully orchestrated relationships between the indoors and the outdoors, and a seamless connection to his surroundings and exacting craftsmanship.
You are in love, I understand, with the Farnsworth House?
I am.
Yeah?
It's a very dear project to me.
And you've photographed it, I guess, endless times.
No, I only photographed it twice.
Twice?
Yes. It was right after the house was purchased by the state of Illinois. And I was invited to develop a portfolio of images of the house. And I did that first in 5 days during summer. And then I went back during winter for some additional images. And those images became a book, Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House, which I can tell you right now that I'm working on the revised edition of it, which will be coming out probably next year. And it will feature a foreword by Paul Goldberger.
Oh,
Very
wonderful.
Excited about that. Yeah. And we're going to add maybe between 5 and 10 new images.
Now, did you shoot the house before the last flood or after the last big flood they had down there?
No, it was right after they purchased the house.
Oh, okay.
So at that point, they had just renovated the house. They had done that provision of the panels, of the wood panels of the cabinets, that they can be taken out when the
water is coming?
The water is coming. So the house was in really great shape.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I understand they're making a movie about it. Have you heard that?
I believe so, yes, with, I believe, Maggie Gyllenhaal.
Maggie Gyllenhaal.
And I forgot who plays him, but I'm looking forward to seeing that. It's a very fascinating story between architect
and client,
and I don't know, I think it's a fascinating topic. Having that house as a backdrop would be even more interesting, especially being such a personal house. When I was photographing there, it was really like an amazing opportunity because they let me by myself in the house. It was just me and the house, a really great moment. But all I kept thinking, I felt like I was inside somebody's head because it was such a conceptual feel there that that idea kept coming to me. But not in a strange way, but in a very welcoming way.
What was your favorite time of day to be in the house?
Well, one of my favorite images that I have of the house, I like light. I like when the architectural object is really well lit. I think you see it's in all its splendor and what's the architects envisioned that object to be. And I really wanted to get the northern facade with light, but in the summer, the only time to do that, because now the trees are grown all around it, was to be there until almost 7 o'clock in the evening. And the house closes at 6. So I had to convince the property manager there to linger a little bit longer so we could get the facade with the light right on it and the white really popping against the vegetation. And I did these images in black and white, so you really see the white brightness against the trees. It's a very powerful image, I would like to think.
I bet. I bet the light sort of bouncing off the different levels of there is fascinating.
It made just like the darkness of the trees around, the dark shade. Now they kind of frame the house in a really interesting way, but there's still a sliver of light in the lawn, kind of like leading to the house. And the light was also hitting that beautiful tree right next to it, to the left. So the trunks are very like lit too. Makes an interesting juxtaposition.
Well, tell me about the film on Renzo Piano. Mm-hmm. He's not an architect that is very well known to a lot of Americans. He's more better known in Europe than he is here. Mm-hmm. But what an incredible architect. What's the story that you followed about him?
Well, first of all, I think he might not be very well known for like everyday Americans, but I think his buildings are, because he's designed some of the most well-known museums in this country. So I think a lot of people go there, might not know him as a name, but they know, if you describe what the buildings are, they'll know. The New York Times building, the Houston, the Menil Collection, the Whitney here now in New York City, which is a super, very successful project, very visited. The way that we connected to this specific project was that we were commissioned by an organization from Switzerland called Art Museums of Switzerland. And they commissioned me and my partner, Axel Stasny, on this project to do films of 12 Swiss museums, very brief films, very social media friendly films. And we did them, and the Baylor and the Centrum Paul Klee were two of the projects, the Baylor being in Basel and the Centrum Paul Klee in Bern. And they were such inspiring projects. They were such interesting projects. And I already had the previous interest in Renzo Piano. So I think we were already like filming, thinking of what else could we do with that? Because it was such an unusual opportunity to be there, to have that access to the museums in that way. So we began filming and we did the project. And then me and Axel discussed other things that we could possibly do with the amount of material that we had. And, I've been covering and following Renzo Piano's work for a while now. I contribute to Metropolis, to Arquidaily, to Casa Vol Brazil. I have my own blog on Facebook that is very popular.
Very popular.
Yes. So I know his work very well. I've attended many interviews with him and all that. And I'm a big fan. I like what he brings to architecture. And I thought this is a really great opportunity to do something special. And so that's what we did. With Axel, we began doing new edits on the film. Also, when we did the original project, we had a very limited time constraint for the films to be. And now, being our own project, we could be more indulgent and have these really long, extended shots that are very immersive. They really connect with the lines of the design, with the space. And Renzo Piano always says that architecture takes time. And I feel like our film, the short film, is an opportunity to do that, to take the time to connect with his architecture and maybe understand it a little bit more, feel it a little bit more, and just connect with it.
It seems that people are doing more and more of these short films about architecture.
I think so. And, we are living in this digital age now that attention span is just so minimal. It's also part of, this concept of abstraction, right? Sometimes you abstract one little moment, but it tells you the whole story. In this case, on the Centrum Paul Klee, for example, there's a shot that is like the whole curve of the facade, all the way to hitting the ground. It's not the whole building. That shot is actually about 45 seconds, but it tells you so much about that design, about where it is, about what the concept of the design is, of the structure, of what the space is going to be like. So I think sometimes it could be short, but it could be very relevant and meaningful, insightful.
Did you get to spend much time with Renzo Piano?
Well, I've interviewed him a couple times because I also write, but he was not involved in this project specifically.
Okay.
But they have been very supportive. His team and the communications, they have been very supportive of the project, helped promote it on their platforms. So we've been very flattered and honored about that.
Well, I know that distribution for any film is one of the toughest challenges, to get it out into the public. Are there any plans to put this online or streaming, or can people buy a DVD, or how can they get their hands on it?
Well, I think eventually it will appear online. The museum videos that we did for the original commissions, they are all on my page, and they can be seen at facebook.com/archiphoto. All the videos are there. These extended versions, these special edits, we call them Archi edits, I think they will be later, maybe online. But right now we just got invited to submit it to another festival.
Okay.
So I think right now they're going to be a little bit more in the limited viewing. But eventually, I think they will.
Sure.
And if they want to buy it as well.
Yeah. People are always asking me, where can they buy these films?
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
What's your next project?
Well, I actually did think of an idea on the first day here of the Architecture+Design Film Festival. Kyle already inspired me to do another project, but that I can't say yet. It's just beginning to cook in my mind.
Okay.
Right now, the most immediate thing that I'm working on is bringing the exhibit that we have at the consulate that is connected to this project as well. While I was shooting all these films, I was also taking photographs. So we're doing an exhibit at the Swiss consulate here in New York City with these photos.
Oh, nice.
Yes. And right now we're looking for venues that would be interested in hosting that exhibit and taking that exhibit to. We're speaking to somebody in Washington, D.C., possibly somebody in Switzerland, and maybe in Sao Paulo in Brazil. The first project right now is to get this exhibit to go other places and tell the story to other people.
You're from Brazil originally?
I am, from Rio de Janeiro.
Did you grow up being a fan of Oscar Niemeyer?
Well, Oscar Niemeyer is an interesting story because I did go to architecture school, exactly the same school that he did in Rio de Janeiro, the federal school. But at that time, there was a certain resentment towards Niemeyer by students and young architects because every important project in Brazil was always immediately given to him. You know, if you had his name attached to it, there would be no controversies about the project because you can't reject a genius, which usually would connect with whatever situation of that project was. And all the projects, big commissions and important, relevant new opportunities will go directly to him. So I think as a young students, we were resentful of that. We wanted to see other ideas, other talents, and other geniuses. So I think it took me a while to get over that feeling. And also I think after leaving Brazil, you begin to see his work in a different way. When you have that distance, you can connect with it in a different way. And I was actually just 2 months ago in Brasilia for the first time. And while I was there, all I kept thinking is that every architecture student should be obliged to go there because it actually quite opens the possibilities and it just, I don't know, it has that wanderlust to the built space and environment that is beyond whether it's practical or visionary or not visionary or utopian. It's just so inspiring. It just brings your inspiration level way up.
Yes, it's interesting how we change over time, isn't it?
Yes. It's like Lorenzo says, architecture takes time.
It sure does. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Coming up, none of George's trips would be complete without a few minutes with author Alan Hess.
If you recall from a few weeks ago, I was interviewing Paul Brokus at the isolated monument in the middle of an island in the Hudson River, and suddenly, Alan Hess comes strolling by. Full disclosure, that was all set up. But the point is, Alan is a walking encyclopedia of modernist architecture, and every time I travel to an event, he is around. Alan is an architect and author who has shed light on many forgotten and neglected styles of post-war American modernist architecture. The Los Angeles Conservancy named him the preeminent authority on Southern California modernism. I named him the Samuel L. Jackson of architecture documentaries because, like the prolific Mr. Jackson in film, Alan has appeared in more documentaries for design than anyone else. We join Alan in the lobby of the Even Hotel in New York City just as breakfast is winding down. He is one of the stars in a Jake and Tracy Gorse documentary on architect Albert Frey, the first American to work for French superstar Le Corbusier, in the film Frey Part 1, The Architectural Envoy. We start by discussing Frey, a name not known to most people, unless perhaps he lived in Palm Springs.
Yes, Albert Frey is worked most of his career in Palm Springs, 60 years, basically, and in relative obscurity out there, which is an interesting part of his story. However, before that, he was born in Switzerland and worked for Le Corbusier, the great, modern master in Paris. in 1929.
One of the few Americans to work for Le Corbusier, I believe.
Yes, and so then when Frey came over to first New York, he was one of the first direct contacts between Le Corbusier's office and New York and the burgeoning modern architecture of that period. So he's an interesting figure from that standpoint.
And how was he doing in New York? Was he working for a firm or working on his own?
He was working with a partner, actually, Lawrence Coker, who, and this is the interesting thing, here, the Swiss guy, born in the mountains of Switzerland, but early on he gets this fascination with America, and he wants to come to America. Of course, what did America mean to a young European architect? It meant the most advanced new technology and ways of constructing buildings. And the future meant the future. Things, and it was being done in America where it was kind of slow in Europe. But he had this obsession, you might even call it, with America. In Le Corbusier's office, he was called the American.
Sure.
Before he'd ever touched a foot on the shores of the New World. But when he came over here, he just really interesting. And this is 1929. This is right on the verge of the Great Depression. But he immediately became part of the New York architecture world. His partner, for example, Lawrence Coker, was the editor at Architectural Record, which was one of the
major publication of the time.
Exactly. So he was very well connected. He wrote theoretical ideas, proposals for new types of architecture and building and so forth. These were published, and he and Coker actually did build a number of small houses, but ones which have proven to be really influential, partly because they were publicized and written about in Architectural Record.
Right.
So it's extraordinary that this young man really found a place in the architectural world here in America very quickly.
Now, explain to our listeners about what was different in the 20s. I mean, particularly, we take things for granted now going through a city like New York. We look at the steel and the concrete and all of that. But back then, this was really emerging technology. This was hot new stuff to build with.
It really was, yeah. Skyscrapers were still evolving. Probably the key technological element was the curtain wall, glass. How did you treat glass? Glass is obviously completely different than stone or brick or steel. So how do you treat it on the exterior of a building with large expanses of glass so that it withstands the weather, so that you can see through it, so that it doesn't break? So, all sorts of challenges with this new material, which today we do take for granted, but which then people were still working out. And this was one of Albert's advantages, because he had worked with Le Corbusier on a building in Moscow, which has a large glass curtain wall.
Oh, okay.
It was called the Centrosoyuz building. It's still there. I've seen
Soyuz, like the astronaut space Soyuz?
Yeah, it's a Russian word, and I can't remember exactly what it means. Centrosoyuz, Central Union, or something like that.
Okay.
But it was an important public building, and it had this glass curtain wall, and Albert had worked on it. So he became in demand here in America because of that skill. You think of the great skyscrapers of that period, the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building. Those are stone buildings. They have glass windows, but they aren't really made of glass as we have come to know it.
Alan Hess has scored 100% on his Russian translation. It indeed does mean union.
Spasiba.
So, besides the materials, things that we also assume now, like air conditioning, that was new. That was coming into vogue in public buildings at the time, and figuring out ways of getting air handling around large buildings was all new technology.
Yes. And, in terms of Albert, he was always very interested in the natural forces, sun, wind, climate, etc. And so he did design very specifically and technically correctly for those sorts of elements.
Now, before he got to Palm Springs, which we'll talk about in a minute, he and Coker designed at least one very interesting house.
Yes, it really became very famous. It was called the Luminaire House. And it actually was just an exhibit building. It was built inside in an exhibit on architecture, a wide range of architecture in this exhibit, but this was the modern exhibit there. And it was absolutely striking, and it was only up for a few months, but it just pulled in the
People went
crowds.
crazy, yeah.
They really did, and got a lot of publicity. And the idea of it was really a very Corbusian idea. It was a 3-story house out of steel, aluminum, metal, and glass, etc.
On stilts, right?
On stilts, raised up. It had a roof garden on the top level, again, a Corbusian idea. And it was pretty much a square box. It had some interesting angles to it, but it was a square metal box. And it just captivated everybody as the house of the future at the time.
Because it had some interesting features in it. It had this more modern-looking kitchen that had existed before with different kinds of appliances that were built into it. It had the air handling systems, which were new to a lot of people. As I recall, it didn't have a fireplace. Is that right?
No, it did not.
And that was very unusual for a house not to have a fireplace.
Yeah, and of course it wasn't a building that was actually meant to be outside or lived in. It was just an exhibit building. But nonetheless, it had it used fold-down tables and very compact and well-designed, so that it was all very convenient and new and modern and functional.
Now, what happened to this house after the exhibition?
Well, it's had a very interesting history. It's a wandering house because it was, after the exhibit, it was purchased by Wallace Harrison, who again was really one of the lions of
famous
New
architect,
York
yes.
architecture.
Helped design the United Nations.
Exactly. Would begin the center of architectural power. And he bought it and moved it. And it was all a movable house. I mean, it could be it was just all screwed together, basically. So
like a giant erector set.
Yeah, and it could be taken apart and moved and then re-erected. And it was re-erected on Harrison's estate here in the New York area, out in the countryside, basically. Again, it was built in about 1930. It, for a couple of decades, was out there, and then Harrison, the state sold it. It had been added to. It hadn't really been kept preserved in its original state. So finally, it was being sold off. It was going to be torn down unless somebody bought it. A school on Long Island did purchase it because a couple of historians there realized just how important it was.
Yeah.
So it was moved and re-erected on this site in Long Island until a couple of years ago when the school didn't want it anymore. And it was put up for sale. Anybody could come and take it and move it. It was going to be moved back here to the New York suburbs and reconstructed there. But then the neighbors got up in arms because they did not want this modern kind of refrigerator-looking box in the middle of their quaint, traditional suburban buildings.
Yeah.
So it was rejected there. And that's when people in Palm Springs came to the rescue. And they said, Albert Frey's work is out here in Palm Springs. We know him. We love him. Many people out there knew him, actually, personally. He died in the 1990s. So they put together an organization and have been raising funds to move it all the way to Palm Springs. And in fact, today it's still in pieces, still in storage, but it is in Palm Springs awaiting a better home, a better life in the future. Again.
And that's supposed to happen for Modernism Week in February of 2019, right? Or is it later than that?
No, there have been some technical difficulties with determining the exact location and the city's arrangement with it, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
So there isn't a fixed date yet, but it is in the near future, shall we say.
So this is in pieces in a tractor-trailer awaiting reassembly.
Yes.
So is there like an instruction manual for this, or do people just have to intuitively figure it out?
Yes, well, the two historians who originally took it and put it at the Long Island school have been just shepherding it so well. And so they know it, and they've kind of figured out how. There's no manual, though, unfortunately. And you can't Google how do you put together an Illuminaire house. But you can kind of figure out how the pieces go together. And there are a lot of photographs and diagrams
and videos and things. They can kind of put it back together.
Yeah.
And is it going to be an exhibition house, or is someone going to live into it, or what's the general plan for it?
That is not completely determined yet. It will be mostly an exhibition house.
Okay.
So when you go to Palm Springs and see all the other wonderful modern architecture there, you will have this also to see. And it seems to be so out of place from New York to Palm Springs, but in fact, Palm Springs has a couple of other really important all-metal houses, like Richard Neutra's Kaufman House.
Yes.
And Donald Wexler's prefabricated metal house, steel houses as well.
It's a Disneyland of modern architecture.
Of modern steel architecture, exactly. So you can go there and just learn so much about how steel evolved as a building material in modern architecture. It'll be really a wonderful sort of thing. Usable, but also a museum.
So tell us about the film. You appear in the film. How did the film come about, and who's producing it, and how did it get going?
Yeah, it is produced by Design on Screen, which has produced a number of other architecture documentaries, and you've reported on many of those. On Bill Kreisel, on Donald Wexler, on Stuart Williams, and other subjects. And it's directed by Jake Gorst, who has directed many of those
films,
other films as well. Yeah, he's an excellent director.
Here in New York, he did the film about the modern ruin,
right,
with Matt Silva.
Right, exactly. So, good background. But Design on Screen has slowly but surely documenting these unknown architects, these architects who did incredible creative work, but who have not gotten the attention they really deserve. So their films are to focus attention. It's a long list of architects that I know Design on Screen is trying to get to, but definitely Albert Frey is on that. So the interesting thing about this film, though, as Jake, the director, got into it, he discovered all of these archives and sources that had never been tapped before about Albert Frey. And so there's a lot of original material in this film, which is really, really fascinating, really, really valuable. In fact, there's so much new material that they decided to make two films.
Yeah, so two-parter.
This is part one, which is screening at the Architecture+Design Film Festival this week here in New York. And then hopefully 2020, the part two will come out.
So part one covers what span in Frey's life?
From his birth in Switzerland up through the late 1930s, which includes his growing up, his education in Europe, and with Corbusier, those years, his years here in New York, working with Coker and so forth. And it touches on his first trip to Palm Springs. But then, interestingly, he was called back to New York to work on the building of the Museum of Modern Art.
Yes,
the original building.
Right.
And so the cliffhanger at the end of the film, it's such a great story, is that at the end of the film, in the late 30s, he's finished his work on the Museum of Modern Art, and he is offered a partnership in one of the most prestigious architecture firms here in New York, the center of the architectural media and criticism, and schooling and the profession and so forth. I mean, this is an incredibly plum job that he is being offered because of his skills in modern technology. And he's also been working with John Porter Clark in Palm Springs as an architect, doing houses mostly, and some small, schools, banks, whatever. And so at the end of the film, it sets up this tension of, does he go the way of, glory and power and fame, or does he go back to obscurity in Palm Springs? So nobody really knew Palm Springs then, certainly not for its architecture.
Right. It hadn't really gotten on the national radar yet.
No, it hadn't. So that's where film number one ends. And
So we'll have to wait until 2020 to find out what happens
well,
to Albert Frey.
It's not a great mystery, but it's a psychological thing. I mean, that's fascinating. That choice, what would you do?
That's a huge choice.
Exactly. And the fact, spoiler alert, he goes back to Palm Springs.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, as a matter of fact. But why? That is the fascinating thing.
Okay.
Why is Palm Springs doing houses and schools and small buildings more satisfying to this incredibly talented young architect than being in the center of the architectural world in New York?
Yeah.
And to me, that
is the story.
That is the story. It's fascinating.
One question we talked about before taping was that Albert's name gets pronounced different ways. Sometimes it's Frey, sometimes it's Frey.
Yeah.
In the film, which I've seen, which is great, you discuss that a little bit. So tell us about which one it is.
Yeah, well, apparently in Switzerland it is Frey. And that's the way that Albert was known, Albert Frey, growing up. But when he came to America, and especially to California, people probably didn't speak that much German or whatever.
Swiss or anything.
So he became Albert Frey, and he let people call him that. He did not try to correct them. And it's one of these, I think, great American stories of people remaking themselves, creating a new identity in the new world. And that's what America and California allows people. And that to me is really core to the significance of Albert Frey. I still call him Albert Frey. Because he's famous because he worked with Le Corbusier, this great modern master. But he only worked for Corbusier for about a year. He worked in California, in Palm Springs, for 60 years. And it's that remade him. He found so much there in the desert, in the California culture, to inspire his architectural desires. And that's, I think, also the most creative and the most significant part of his career. It was California that shaped him, I think, much more than Le Corbusier.
Sure. So, unfortunately, architecture documentaries like this don't get the same distribution as, say, the Avengers: Age of Ultron.
No.
Or, so, how do people find the films by Design on Screen or see them? Are they on any of the streaming services yet?
Not yet, but they're going to be. And there's a website, Design on Screen, that does have them. Many of them are available on CD.
Okay.
And I know they're working on arrangements with streaming services now as well. I haven't heard the latest on that. But
that would be great.
Worth checking on the website.
Be able to get those more widely distributed.
Yeah.
All right, well, Alan, thanks so much for joining us. And I can't wait to see what the reception is for the film here.
Good. I'm very eager too. Thank you, George.
Thanks for listening. US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special agent for Modernist Houses, 919-995-0550. Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows and access 2.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. US Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Researcher Cindy Stratton, not a real name, was recently sighted in West Palm Beach looking for a Wi-Fi hotspot. US Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, Inc., a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will see you soon with another widescreen Sense Surround encoded cinematic edition of US Modernist Radio.
Cut. That's a wrap.